So we are here this evening. This is part of the work of the Land Preservation Working Group. You remember from the assembly that part of our task was to explore preservation options, to learn as much as we can about the context, and to share the learning. And just to refresh our minds, the members of the working group, those of us who live here, it's Marie Lourdes, Jesse, and I. And then Mary Catherine is in Denver, and Sharon Cassing is in St. Louis. So that's the working group. And Marie Lourdes is going to get us started with a prayer, along with Nancy and Mary Kay.
So let us begin. All land is alive. It is part of us, and it is part of the community around us. The land expresses wholeness and calls us to the truth that everything is one.
Land is alive.
Land is alive. It gives us a broad perspective of time. Its life cycle is much longer than ours, which draws us back to prehistoric times when it was a part of an inland sea. The long view of its history connects us to the cosmos and inspires hope for the future.
Land is alive. Land is alive. It nourishes life and provides food in many different forms. Food for animals, for healing, for the heart, for the body, for the part of us that seeks beauty.
Land is alive.
Because earth is alive and filled with the steadfast love of God, it helps us remember these basic truths.
We are one part of the community of life, which calls us to collaborate with others.
May we remember. A mutual relationship with land requires that we give back to the land, which has met our needs throughout the history of the community.
May we remember.
Land itself has a mission and is calling us to respond. May we remember that earth is indeed alive and filled with the steadfast love and wisdom of God.
So this evening we have an opportunity to learn more about the broad context of land as mission. I was remembering this morning, remember when Carol Zinn talked about, she said that religious life is a response to the gospel in a particular historical and cultural context. And so this evening we're reflecting on the context of land. And we have with us this evening Greg Abernathy. Greg is the director of the Kentucky Natural Land Trust, and he will be sharing more about that, as well as the broad perspective of what's happening with land conservation in Kentucky, and the location of our land and the watershed that we're part of. Several of us had the opportunity, I think maybe 3 years or so ago, to hear Greg share at the Religious Lands Roundtable. And ever since then, I've wanted him to come here. And so tonight is the night. Greg, thank you.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a great honor. I've actually never been on campus on your grounds here, and it's quite beautiful. It was a beautiful winter day to show up. And your opening prayer, I wish my opening slide, which often in my presentations I have, was the Wendell Berry quote that I always love, which is, "What I stand on is what I stand for." I think that echoed through what you were just opening with tonight. So I'm going to give sort of a broad overview of what Kentucky, what conservation sort of looks like in our state, and give us a more of a reflection on how things stand in the state of Kentucky. I'll look at talking about this concept. It's called large landscape conservation, and sort of where some of those efforts are afoot in the state, including the Salt River watershed that we sit in now. And I'm going to introduce some concepts around resiliency, which is a buzzword you hear all the time, but it has an ecological sense that's talked a lot about these days. And then if I have time, I'm going to give you a little bit of highlight on some of the work that Kentucky Natural Lands Trust has been doing for nearly 25 years down in eastern Kentucky along Pine Mountain. So, and I think at the end we'll have some time for conversations and questions. So whenever I give a talk, it doesn't matter what group, I like to start off with this slide. And should I move? Can you see all right? Should I move back just a hair? I can. Okay, let me do that. So I always like to start off with revisiting what is biodiversity. And a simple definition of biodiversity is the variety of all living things and their roles and connections within ecosystems. There's a lot there that's often distilled down to the web of life, which is a very beautiful, simple way to think about biodiversity. But biodiversity is incredibly complex, and I'm just going to walk through this little graphic that helps illustrate how complex it is. At the foundation of biodiversity is what we call genetic diversity. So the diversity of the genes in any individual species. And this drawing, it happens to be this little black-throated green warbler. So the genetic diversity of that species is vitally important to it being able to exist on this planet and adapt and carry on in healthy populations. So that's foundational to the web of life. The next tier of biodiversity is called species diversity. So this is the diversity of individual species, whether that's the black bear or the hemlock tree or the warblers or the Luna moth. All of these species are species diversity. Where we find species that sort of occur together, it's what scientists call natural communities. And it's the diversity of natural communities over a larger landscape that gives us our third level, which is ecosystem diversity. So it's genetics, it's species, it's ecosystem diversity. That web is replicated over and over and over all across the planet. In some places, there's more intense and incredible biodiversity, but biodiversity is present throughout the whole planet. And that's the vital support system that all life on the planet depends on. So I always like to start here and remind everyone that web of life is incredibly vitally important and incredibly complex. So a couple other things about biodiversity. There's a few different factors that influence biodiversity in any region. One is the geologic history of the region. And we heard about that in the prayer. There was an inland sea in this part of Kentucky, but that past geologic history and the resulting landforms are really important to influencing what type of biodiversity we find in a region. Areas that have similar geologic history and similar landforms can be grouped in what's called physiographic regions. And I say all this because Kentucky is really fascinating, and that Kentucky, I forget, these lasers don't work on screens. Here's Kentucky. And so what's fascinating is Kentucky has three very distinct regions. One is the coastal plain, which is the species that are much more common to the south. So cypress swamps, they reach their northern extent in western Kentucky, right up here. The central part of the state where we sit now is what's called the interior low plateau. So that's the oak hickory forest and historically giant prairies that occurred here. And then out in the eastern part of the state, it's called the Appalachian Highlands. But we're centrally located, so we get both northern and southern influences. So Kentucky is amazingly diverse because we have the Appalachian Mountains, we have this interior low plateaus, and then we have cypress swamps in the western part of the state. So incredible biodiversity here. The other factor that greatly influences biodiversity is our human history. And Kentucky has over 12,000 year documented history of human activity in the state. The results of which are playing themselves out in our current state of the environment. We have habitat impacts, it's habitat conversion, whether that's from poor logging practices or urban sprawl or some of the worst being mountaintop removal. We also have the unintentional introduction of invasive species that outcompete our native species, and then we have issues with land, air, and water pollution. If that's all coupled with shifts in the climate, what we have is biodiversity is sort of in peril and struggling. The results are which here in Kentucky, there are 18 species that are extinct from the planet that once occurred in Kentucky. So they're no longer found on the earth. There's another 36 species that are extirpated. That means that they're no longer in Kentucky in their native range, but they still exist elsewhere in their range. They're just no longer found in Kentucky. The bigger concern here, those are very troubling, but this bottom one, species on the brink, the state nature preserves track these species, and there's nearly 700 species that are considered to be on the brink of either headed towards extirpation or maybe worse, extinction. So I like to use these maps that I helped develop when I worked at the state nature preserves many years ago. This is a conceptual map of what Kentucky looked like at pre-settlement. The dark green and the light green are just two different types of forest, but Kentucky was thought to be 85 to 90% forest, intact forest throughout the state. The lighter brown areas were the vast prairies that we had, which there were millions of acres of prairies. And the bright yellow were the vast wetlands that we have. You can see much of that's out in the western part of the state. So a map of today's Kentucky looks drastically different. And I like to go back and forth because one thing you see is that the yellow is, you can probably barely see it. It's still here. We still have wetlands. They're just greatly reduced. The brown prairies have primarily been converted to agriculture. So there are prairies that exist. They're more postage stamp size. They're not large, intact ecosystems. And the forest has been reduced to 50% of the state is now forested from what had been 85 to 90% of the state. So I'm going to shift gears and talk a little bit about this idea of the importance of large landscape conservation. And I'm just going to start here. There were two really important reports that came out at the end of last year. One was the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and then one was a US report called the Fourth National Climate Assessment. Both of them basically urged the importance of addressing our carbon diet and trying to keep things in check and under a 1.5 degrees Celsius rise. Both reports pointed to what's widely being discussed these days about natural climate solutions. So there's lots of things that we can improve in technology to address some of our issues, but there's a big gains to be had around natural climate solutions. This is how do you ensure that you keep the carbon storage in soils, in agricultural lands, and in forest intact, or how can you improve them? So there's three kind of parts to natural climate solutions. One is straight protection, like how can you keep the carbon that's in place protected so it won't be converted? The next is how do you improve management? If you improve management, you might be able to improve carbon storage. And then the third is restoration. You know, you can restore farmland, you can restore forests. So all of those collectively make about 1/3 of what we need to consider to sort of address some of the shifting climate. The rest is a combination of technology and other things, but the returns on natural climate solutions are profound because the entry and cost of it are a fraction of the cost of other things that deal with climate. So when we go back to the map of Kentucky, I said it's 50% forested. Forests play a big role in natural climate solutions. And so it would go to say that Kentucky has an opportunity to play a big role in climate solutions. What I like to point out, this map, 50% forest, is a stat that you often hear when people talk about the state of Kentucky, which is a lot of forest. But we have to remember that we have 85,000 miles of roads, and we've got thousands of miles of railroads and utility corridors. So each of these cut the forest into smaller and smaller pieces. So this map, we could talk the rest of the night on, but I just want to point out that this is taking all the forest in this map and breaking it into what are called large forest intact areas that have greater ecological function. So there's still vast areas of Kentucky that have big tracts of land. And in fact, there's big areas throughout the Salt River watershed, and they stretch down to where we are here. Within these large forest tracts, there are known areas that wildlife use. And this is whoops, I keep pointing out the wrong thing. This is a conceptual map that shows some of the important wildlife corridor areas that are used throughout the state. So these red corridors are known areas of intact habitat and spaces that species sort of navigate the greater urbanized landscape through. And a big part of this comes down in the Salt River, and I'll return to that here shortly. So within Kentucky, there is a variety of lands that are sort of conservation lands. And I say that in a broad sense because these lands have very differing management objectives. National forests are fantastic, but they have very wide management perspective. Military bases are actually important. Like Fort Knox has 100,000 acres primarily forested. People often don't think of a military base as a conservation land, but it's really important bat habitat. There's also national parks, which obviously are at a totally different standard of protection. So within here, this is also a combination of some easements that have been done on where people, you can maintain your land, you can add protection to the land where you still maintain ownership, but you affect change by what's permitted on the land. And there's all kinds of programs either with land trust or with federal agencies. The Natural Resource Conservation Service does this as well. So collectively, this map shows where all those lands exist. And that cumulative amount is less than 8% of the state of Kentucky under some level of management. Now, this is not to discount all the private landowners, many of which are very land proud and do good jobs. It's just that they have not added some permanent protection on their property. So there's two takeaways from that. One is there's more opportunity to conserve more land, but there's a vast opportunity to work with landowners to work on these programs where they implement and affect change through easements or long-term protection. One other notable point is that all the lands surrounding Kentucky have conserved more land than Kentucky. So of all the 7 states around us, we have the lowest percentage of our land base that's in some form of land conservation. It just has not been a priority of Kentucky. I mean, much of our economy is a resource extraction economy, whether that's timber or coal or other things. It just has not driven our overall efforts here in the state. So I think it was 2014, there was a really interesting article in Smithsonian Magazine that came out. And there's a scientist by the name of E.O. Wilson, who some of you may be aware of. But he put an article in Smithsonian Magazine that was called The Wildest Idea on Earth. And basically his concept was that for all life to be sustained on the planet, we need to protect half of the earth for natural systems and half of the earth for humans. Now, that's not to say that we're quarantining off and there's a definitive line, but it means we really have to have definitive change and affect large landscapes to help sustain all life on the planet. That grew into what's now been called the Half Earth Project. And what was really great is that was almost 5 years ago now, but it got a lot of national coverage. It was in a lot of newspapers, and it has launched a lot of things in the last 5 years around this Half Earth idea. I was very happy to see it, but I wanted to just share with you that, sorry, I'm jumping ahead. This was a conceptual map for North America. There's all kinds of important areas in the greater landscape, but this was some of the more high-ranking areas. And Central Appalachia, which is the eastern part of the state of Kentucky, it's known globally as some of the most important biologically diverse regions on the planet. So, but I want to share this picture. This is from a report that came out in 1992 that was done by what was called Wild Earth. It was a journal that was out in the early 90s. And I'm going to look at my notes so I don't forget when they released this special issue, it was called the Wildlands Project. It was this concept and this idea for North America. It was really innovative, and they claimed it to be the most important document in conservation history when it came out in 1992. And I recently was looking back through this, and there's some really fascinating names on it. Bill McKibben was part of it, which he founded 350.org, which I'm sure some of you know about, but also Terry Tempest William, who's also a great conservation writer. And there were some fundamental people, Reed Nossum, Michael Soleil, and all these people helped pull this together. And this was 92, so it's many, many years ago. I'm going to show you what their map looked like here in Kentucky. It's very similar to what our map I showed you before looks like. But their whole idea of half Earth, they were talking about this in 1992. So I say this, that scientists have been echoing this need for conservation in large systems for a long time, to the point that it might be time to start believing what we know about this, right? And taking some action. So I'm glad Half Earth is getting the traction, but there is a long legacy of cutting edge science and conservation to back it up. So you can see this is the conceptual map that a bunch of conservation groups worked on in the state years ago, and it sort of mimics Kentucky's sort of in this section within their map that came out in '92. So that map also feeds into that group that put out that map has now become the Wildlands Network, which is, they work throughout all of North America. And this is their Eastern US map, which the scale is really hard to see, but it's just to show that there are giant pathways and wildlife corridors throughout Eastern America that are known to be really important. And Kentucky plays a really important role in this. This is a cool map that I like to almost meditate to, because it's so enjoying to look at. This is the Nature Conservancy modeled these pathways of how it's believed that species will start to adjust and adapt to shifting climate. And there's 3 colors on here. The purples are mammals, the blues are birds, and the yellowish ones are amphibians. But I'm going to point, this is, Kentucky's right in here. And it's just like we're this super highway for migration. And particularly when you get out in Eastern Kentucky, but it's coming right across all of Kentucky. So Kentucky's right in the midst of shifts in species ranges as they adapt to climate change. So this idea of large landscape conservation is really important to safeguarding the natural capital and the resiliency found in the landscape. And I'm going to return to this idea of resiliency and what resiliency really means from natural setting. But I'm going to highlight a few of the kind of intact large areas of the state. I'm just going to show you some pictures. So here's the map. You know, all these really darker green areas are some of the larger intact systems. But if we kind of travel across the state, these are some of the, you know, there are some very big intact wetlands out in the western part of the state. As you move closer to where we are here, sorry, oh no, I don't know, I'm going the wrong direction. It doesn't want to advance. Oh, there it is. I'm being impatient. This is the Green River, which is not far away. You know, of course, Mammoth Cave and the Green River corridor is incredibly important and very unique. It's one of the high-ranking biodiverse rivers in North America. Closer to home, within the Salt River, is the Knob region, and there are some very vast intact areas within the Knobs region. And if we travel a little further south, this is where I spend a lot of my time and passion. That's Pine Mountain, which I'll come back to and talk about, down in the far eastern portion of the state. And then one of the most intact and largest stretches of forest in the state is Martin's Fork. This is down by Cumberland Gap National Historic Park. It's sort of on the line with Kentucky and Virginia. And there's nearly 33,000 acres of contiguous intact forest there, which is a profoundly large tract of forest and wild areas. So Kentucky does have, you know, despite me going through the gloom of how fragmented we've made our landscape, there are some very vast, important areas of the state of Kentucky. Oops. So I'm going to return and come back to the Salt River if I can navigate. I don't know what, it's kind of losing itself. Okay, here's a model or a map that shows all of the Salt River watershed. There's been a new initiative that's been unfolding over the last few years of the conservation groups working in the region, particularly Bernheim and Bluegrass Land Conservancy, KNLT, and a whole suite of folks like Kentucky Waterways Alliance. We're all trying to take a collective look at what's going on in the Salt River, because it's very unique, it's very important, and you also have massive growth just spilling south from Louisville. And so this map is hard to see, but I'm going to point, you know, Loretta sits right down on these fringes of these green swaths that extend down. If we, oh no, I'm not sure what's not liking me now. Okay, this is a zoomed in, the forest fragmentation map. So it's zoomed in so you can see a little better. This is Loretta forest. It's just smaller acreage forest. So this is all the forest. The big green is large intact areas, but we're sitting down in the southern edge of the watershed, but there are particularly around, this is Bernheim and that is Fort Knox, which are some of the largest intact areas actually in the state, which, a lot of people would default to thinking about the mountains as where you have more of it, but they rank really high in some of the largest contiguous tracts of forest existing in the state. So beyond working in Eastern Kentucky, this is Bernheim here, and this is part of Fort Knox, but Kentucky Natural Lands Trust is working on the riparian corridors that connect both of those. And some of the purple spots there are both lands that we own outright, and they're also conservation easements where the landowner has kept their land and they've just entered into an agreement with us that basically they gave up certain rights to. So it would be a perpetual farm or a perpetual forest, but they've given up rights but retained ownership. And there's lots of benefits around doing that. I mean, one being the long-term vision of the property is sort of, enshrined in this agreement. And then I'm going to come back. I showed you where Loretta is here. I have, so here's your property, as you all know. And if I'm not mistaken, you sort of sit on the crest of two different watersheds, which is really interesting. Am I right with that? I think this section over across 49 goes down into the Rolling Fork, and this goes up into the Brushy Fork. But ultimately, it all feeds into the Salt River. So in many ways, you're sort of at the headwaters of the origins of this greater watershed. So, your role and the implications of what are happening on your property. I know you have forests, and I know that you've entered into some conservation programs and doing some of the pollinator programs here, but that sort of, is the cumulative impact of what I also like to remind people is you're feeding in the Salt River, which feeds into the Ohio, which feeds into the Mississippi, which feeds into the fourth largest watershed on the planet. So, when you're sitting here, water that falls here ultimately ends up in New Orleans. So, you're part of this greater connected landscape. And so the steps you're taking to advance your conservation here have cumulative impacts throughout that watershed. So going back to this idea of resiliency, I'm just going to spend a few minutes and give you a little bit of overview of what resiliency means from a natural perspective. So this is a map, the Nature Conservancy, which is here in Kentucky it's the largest conservation organization on the planet. They do some really great stuff. We work very closely with them, but they've taken this sort of innovative look of looking at the landscape in a completely different way. And they've done these really advanced computer modeling. And I'm going to explain what resiliency means. But this map, basically, if you have green areas on the map, the darker green they are, the more resilient that landscape is, which means that species that occur there and natural communities that occur there are better to persist and adapt in the face of a changing climate. There's more options for them in the landscape. And then it goes down to brown, which is below. It's not as high ranking resiliency. Now, resiliency can be affected at small scales and large scales. So you can improve resiliency within 1,000 acres or less, or you can improve it as 50,000 acres or less. There's a scale of how you impact it. But what's interesting is a big part of Kentucky, particularly east, ranks really high, but also big chunks of the Salt River stretching all the way down into here also rank high because this is a pretty textured landscape. That's one of the things I'll tell you that influences resiliency. So resiliency has a handful of factors. One is geology and landforms, which I talked a little bit about before. It's also what's called local and regional connectivity. And then it's the biological condition or the biodiversity. So these are some really simple, nice graphics that talk about, this is called geodiversity. So the diversity of geology that you have on the landscape, which Kentucky has a very unique and varied geology, and the Salt River does too. So geodiversity is one. The resulting landforms, whether you have floodplains or you have knobs or you have mountains, that diversity of landscape offers a whole variety of different habitat types to species. Those are two important factors. the idea of connectivity is within landscapes, how connected are things to each other, like just more locally connected, and then thinking on a bigger scale, how are they connected across bigger landscapes? So it's local and regional connectivity drives resiliency, and then the biologic condition. And Kentucky does rank pretty high in our biodiversity because of that uniqueness of having the mountains to the interior low plateau to the big swamps out west. So we have a really wide diversity. We're quite known for our aquatic diversity in particular. And a lot of that actually is right here in this region and part of the Green River. So I'm gonna spend a few minutes and sing the praises of what we've been up to at KNLT for the last, next year will be our 25th year of working. So has any of you been to Pine Mountain by chance? I'm always curious if folks, you may not realize but if you've ever driven to Knoxville on 75, you've been to Pine Mountain, because the southern end of it is Jellicoe Mountain that right when you hit Tennessee, but that's actually in fact the southern end of Pine Mountain. And so this ridge right here, this section is 75 that you drive, but it stretches 125 miles through southeastern Kentucky up to Virginia. And it's called a mountain, which is almost misnamed because it's a long linear ridge, really. People think of a peak as a mountain, but KNLT is this long linear ridge. So it's in this picture, this arcing ridge is the mountain just going on and on and on. It's really something to see, and it's a higher elevation than the Cumberland Plateau, which is what most of Eastern Kentucky is. This is the first of the Appalachian ridges. So if you get up on Pine Mountain, and there's places you can actually drive up to overlooks, you really have this profound vista. And we like to tell people, if you're up there, that wind you're feeling it's literally the highest point that when the winds leave the Rockies that they get before they hit the Appalachians. It's a little poetic justice, but it is kind of pretty to think about. So one of the really unique things about Pine Mountain is the geologic history, which we've talked about a few times, and it's called an overthrust fault. So Pine Mountain, the earth buckled and Pine Mountain popped up, and one of the upsides of that was the merchantable coal, which is very common in eastern Kentucky, was exposed and eroded away. And so one really nice thing about our work is we've not been on one side or the other of what has been the dominant economy of the region. So we've just been protecting this really unique mountain that's intact and hasn't had the pressure of the surrounding landscapes. The other thing that's really interesting is we're sitting in limestone country here, but when you go out into the mountains, the limestone is buried. It's really, really low. Pine Mountain exposed a seam of limestone. So there are hundreds of caves along the north face of the mountain, and with caves come really unique species, and often isolated species that might only occur in one cave on the whole planet. So it's got really unique geology, and it's got a really unique landforms. This is just a topography map. Kentucky sits here. That's Central Appalachia. Central Appalachia is a really highly textured landscape, which means there's all kinds of habitats, a variety of habitats sort of in close proximity to one another. You zoom in, here's Kentucky. We're sitting on the western edge of Central Appalachia. You've seen this map a few times, so it zoomed in here. Pine Mountain's a series of these large intact tracts of forest. And it's part of this map that you've seen too, part of the corridor. Pine Mountain falls right in this. Basically, it's going from the southwest to the northeast. So not everything moves north to south when it's migrating or changing around, but species are tending to make those shifts in their ranges. So there's thousands of species that are documented on Pine Mountain. Nearly 100 are considered rare. When I was talking about those species on the brink, so there's 100 species that are considered to be rare in the state of Kentucky. And there's a handful that are only found on Pine Mountain. That's the only place in the entire world they're found. And those are cave species. And they might just be a little cave beetle, but, going back to that biodiversity, that genetics and that interconnectedness, that little cave beetle plays into a larger web of life. So the biodiversity is pretty profound there. And this is also a great fact, the mixed mesophytic forest, which is a mouthful to say, but that's found in central Appalachia, in eastern Kentucky and West Virginia. And it's known to be the second most biodiverse forest within the temperate zone. We're not talking about the tropics, just the temperate zone on the planet. It's the second most biologically diverse region on the planet in the temperate zone. The area that ranks higher is in Southeast Asia, and Southeast Asia has really giant mountains, so you have a lot more elevational change with species and a lot more diversity. But Central Appalachia is incredibly, incredibly biodiverse. And then another unique thing about our project is that it's a really incredible example of a public-private partnership, because the mountain's a mixture of state lands and federal lands. There's national forests, there's state parks. Kentucky's first state park is there. And then there's lands like that the KNLT has, the Nature Conservancy has land down there. So it's this matrix and mixture of conservation lands, nonprofit lands, state nature preserves, national forests, and state parks. This map is incredibly difficult to show and really hard to see on a map. And I usually like to bring a big fold out because Pine Mountain's long and linear, so it's really hard to show. But the mountain starts here in Tennessee. It goes up to Harlan, stretches from Harlan up to Elkhorn City. And this map is just showing the matrix of what I was just talking about: national forests, state lands, a whole bunch of different things. The mountain footprint itself, it's 125 miles long, but the actual mountain itself is roughly 180,000 acres. And about 65,000 acres of that are under some type of protection right now. A big part of that is state, the blue. A big chunk is also federal, and then there's nonprofit lands. And then if we break this down a little bit further, this slide just shows all the different entities. You know, there's 5 different state partners that have land. The U.S. Forest Service has the bulk, has all the federal lands, and then there's KNLT, the Nature Conservancy, and then a group called the Pine Mountain Settlement School, which is a fantastic partner down in the mountains. So one thing I like to point out, KNLT has done about 10% right now, and currently holds about 10% of that 65,000. But we've historically worked with the state, and some of our lands have turned into state lands. And so when we count those, we've actually done 7% of that 57%. So KNLT has done 17% of the total 65,000 acres. So after the federal government, we've affected the most change of conservation on Pine Mountain. And the last thing, I'm just going to show you this quickly. Bland Forest is the most magical place, I'd like to say, on the planet, but it's down in Harlan. This is really what started KNLT's work back in the 90s. It's a few thousand acres of uncut forest that was discovered part of state inventories. They realized it existed. We worked with the state nature preserves. It's called the Office of Kentucky Nature Preserves now. And we're able to protect this fantastic treasure. It's an incredible part of our natural heritage. This is one of the features called Knobby Rock that's halfway up the mountain. That's just a really spectacular geologic feature to hike up to. But this is a map that shows what started as 2,000 acres now has grown to 3,500 acres that the state has. And then in purple, again, this is hard to see on this scale, but everything in purple around it is land that KNLT owns now or is in the process of purchasing. So it's going on 25 years since that initial acquisition at Blanton. The state's property has grown to 3,500. KNLT has almost that much equal amount of land around it. So from what had just been an unknown discovered old growth forest now is on the cusp of 7,000 acres of protected land around it in the last 25 years. And that work is the product of 20 different interactions with landowners. It wasn't just one landowner. We've been working, and some of it is this long game of patience of working with landowners. Some of the conversations have been 18 years before someone decides to work with us. But it's patience and persistence that have gotten us to where we are today. So the final thing that our work dovetails into is it's tourism and the livability of communities in the region. Tourism is an important part of the diversified economy down there. It's not the game saver. It's one small piece of a changing economy, but also adding to the livability of communities like Pineville and Harlan and Cumberland and Whitesburg. Along Pine Mountain is what's called the Great Eastern Trail. I'm sure many of you have heard of the Appalachian Trail, which is the long distance hiking trail. Well, fewer people have heard about the Great Eastern Trail. It's a proposed trail from southern New York to Alabama that passes primarily through Kentucky along Pine Mountain. 1/3 of the 100-mile stretch is complete along Pine Mountain, and all of our acquisitions, or most of them, I should say, are dovetail into making the expansion of this trail a reality. So wrapping things up with Pine Mountain, we sort of have 3 pillars of work. You know, foundational to our work and why we started everything was biodiversity. You know, old growth forests was what drove us to form a group of friends, formed our group. But Pine Mountain itself is highly biodiverse. So we continue to stay focused on biodiversity protection. This idea that the region we're working with is also incredibly climate resilient, so that adds to it. And then finally, which I would think you all will appreciate, is there's this term in the region called just transition. It's what does a fair, equitable, sustainable new economy look like for a region that provided the whole US with cheap energy and took the sacrifices with it. So within this just transition and diversification of economy, our work happens to be valued in different ways. We're not leading that. It's just that our assets that we've been working on play into adding value to the communities as they look for a just future. So that 3rd pillar has been a really fascinating place to sort of have found us and navigate how we work with communities for the value add of the work we're doing. So this is really my last, I know I've said a couple, this is my last thing, but this is really my last one. I'm gonna leave you with a quote. It's one of my favorite quotes. There's a conservation visionary and hero, Doug Peacock, and he just says, arm yourself with friendship and love the earth. So I think it's a good thing that I thought you all would appreciate. So I'm really grateful to kind of tell this story for you all. And if there's time for questions, I welcome any follow-up conversations, but thanks so much.
I wanted to ask you about resilience.
Sure.
I mean, I kind of know the word, but when you're talking about your kind of resilience, is it like there are lots of trees and so they absorb the carbon?
So what's interesting about it is partly the biologic condition, but what's interesting is it's looking at the underlying geology, basically. What's the geology and what are the landforms, which means where you have more textured landscape, like you do have that here in the Salt River, you have subtleties of different types of habitat. If you're on a big plain, you can imagine that that's a single long stretching habitat without a variety of options. But when you get into more textured landscape, there's subtleties of habitat that species can start to subtly adapt and change with changing conditions. Part of the idea is, so I'm sorry, so one thing is geology, and then it's also how intact and connected is that landscape, or how fragmented it is, and then what is the biologic condition which you're speaking to. So one idea and one kind of way sometimes people talk about it is it's protecting the stage, though we don't know what the future actors may be. So, you know, you think of performance, like you can't have ballet if you don't have a stage. So we can't have intact ecosystems if we don't have intact habitats, even if they're sort of reassembling themselves and changing over time. Historically, species have changed and migrated around and reassembled themselves, but things are happening at a different rate now. So the idea is if you have larger, intact, connected places, things can find a way to persist forward. Does that help?
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank
you.
What other things would you say that Loretto could do on our land?
Yeah. So, like I said, this is my first visit, but I did kind of learn some from talking with Susan about some of the programs that you all have done. And I think, you know, fundamental is you all can maintain ownership and find creative ways to affect and sort of basically plan out what your long-term vision is through like the CREP is it CREP that you have? CRP, yeah, the CRP program. But there's other initiatives around, it's called the Healthy Forest Reserve. Basically the NRCS service is one entity that has abilities to work with groups. Sometimes there's money to help incentivize the conservation to add sort of covenants and restrictions to your land. Doesn't take the land away from you, and often may just be complementary to the way you're already managing your land. So finding the right tools, whether that's with NRCS, or I know the Bluegrass Land Conservancy, they hold easements, and we do few easements ourselves, because most of the land in Eastern Kentucky, it's at a rate that we're able to buy it, and landowners are looking for that. But in your scenario, affecting more permanent vision, if you have a collective vision for what you hope for that's evolving, is through finding the right partner that would welcome easements. And easements have a lot of flexibility to them. You kind of carve out and define what you think are your sort of initial needs, and then you may set aside and define the management strategies for the remainder of the property. I know you have, I don't remember how many acres of forest here, but you have pretty big stretches of forest. You have big agricultural fields, which I know that you've been doing sound management on. So all of those things have the collective benefit of, I was speaking to that space of over 90% of Kentucky is in private ownership. So many of those, it's not to say, oh, conserved lands are the only real contributor to the bigger picture. I think a lot of landowners, particularly in Kentucky, are, they're proud landowners and they're making good decisions. It's just that what is the long-term ability for that to be persistent? You're making a commitment now I'm not saying Loretto, I'm just saying I'm passionate about my farm and I've made all these commitments. In the absence of an easement, that long-term vision for what happens in the next generation or two is not necessarily defined. So easements is one way. If there are creative ways within easements to find associated revenue that can come with giving up some of those abilities for what you do on your land. And then I know you're already consulting because you're doing pollinator work. You're taking the steps to get good advice and sound advice to sort of guide your stewardship here. But like I said, you all sit at the top of this 4th largest watershed on the planet. So what you're doing here has implications, downstream into the greater landscape. So I applaud your efforts, and I'm glad you have your land committee and you're sort of thinking about your long-term visions here.
Caught on that. I was thinking about when you talked about the pollination and the pollinators. I was thinking we're trying to raise some bees and things like that, but is there like a group that we might dovetail into that would help us do that rather than we doing it just by ourselves?
That would help with that would help you with the management of that or guide you in the process.
Or even do it themselves on our land.
Well, I
don't know.
There are creative ways. I don't have off the top of my head what that suggestion is, but there are creative ways where agricultural landowners are also finding opportunities to partner. One of the biggest obstacles in the agricultural community right now is access to land. So young people that are interested have a big land barrier in Kentucky or elsewhere to have access. So there have been creative ways where there might be an NRCS easement that helps improve the agricultural quality of the land, but also opens up the opportunity to create like a partnership with, a local or regional farmer that just doesn't have the capital to get in the game. So I don't know specifically on bees, but I do know the state apiary folks and who are working on that. And so if you're not connected with them, I'm glad to at least make those introductions. Because there are a lot of people doing lots of creative things, all the way from local foods and local agricultural economies to forests. And one thing I hear and I think about a lot is Kentucky is sort of a reflection of elsewhere in the world. We have a changing economy, we have an urbanization happening, but we're primarily in a rural state, which is reflective of a lot of parts of the globe that are transitioning. And so I think we're a reflection of the world, and we also could be a model for, figuring out these complicated systems and being an example for, how you can pull it off and make a better future for the coming generations.
Thank you so much for your presentation. So much of it was really instructive and inspiring. I want to make a comment and then ask a question about being at the top of the watershed that ends down in New Orleans. Many people here have heard me talk about my experience in New Orleans 2.5 years ago. I was able to be part of a climate convergence for emerging leaders within faith communities. And we met with survivors of Katrina and many fishermen and crabbers along the coast there to talk about how climate disruption is having a profound effect on their daily lives. And one of the things that we all realized was that almost all of us lived in the watershed. And at this time, I still lived in Colorado, and still I lived in the watershed that ended right there. And that it was us and our lives and our actions that were not solely, it's also the oil industry down there, but so much of it was us, and that we were the beginning of the degradation of their livelihoods and of their lands. And one of the fishermen said to me when I was having a conversation with him about, what do you want us to do when we go back to our communities? And he said, you need to be our voice, because we don't have a voice ourselves. And I've thought about that and talked with groups about that a lot since then. But I wonder, are you aware? I mean, I'm just thinking about, like, is there a partnership program? Is there anything that we can do to see the faces of the people at the very bottom of the stream, and that so that we can connect more with them? So many of the issues that they were struggling with in terms of, I can't pass my family business that we've been running for generations, I can't pass that on to my kids. They can't make a living do this. I hear echoes of that here in Kentucky. And I just wonder, have you had direct experience trying to bridge the gap there a little bit more?
Yeah, that's a incredible thing to try to navigate and determine. And I think one of the challenges, even just, I mean, if we think about it from a climate conversation, which is why you were there and why they're saying we're impacted, is Kentucky is somewhat buffered. And so the reality, we're not on the front lines like those communities are actually embracing and trying to have those conversations. So not everyone is thinking in this space and thinking about that greater implications of their actions, particularly because we're just buffered. We're in the interior of this place. We are getting massive rain events, which people are starting to notice, but we're not getting wildfire fires and these other things that are just like frontline communities are experiencing. So I think it's one of the difficulties for like the collective commitment in Kentucky to be aware of that. I'm not aware of direct lines of communication. There are big watershed initiatives that work with community groups and conservation partners throughout the Ohio and the greater Mississippi watershed that I know, like Kentucky Waterways Alliance is one of the leaders, particularly in Kentucky within that, because Pine Mountain is also the same thing. It's the headwaters, 2 of 3 different watersheds that all end up in the same watershed that you all drain into. What I think is not fully here in Kentucky, but I think is coming, and occasionally we hear it, is these realities, because that conversation you're having was not necessarily a climate, was saying I can't pass my business on to my kids that we've done for generations. And it wasn't a politicized climate conversation. It was just a reality of what they were facing. There are these initiatives that I'm aware of in North Carolina has something called the North Carolina Climate Conversations, and it's the same thing. They're having conversations with orchard owners, rural landowners, and it's just them simply talking about their observations. There's nothing politicized about it. It's the reality of what they're experiencing and trying to communicate, which I think they're finding offers an opening of greater concern. That it's not this for whatever reasons, it's on some levels it's become politicized and divisive. But the reality is the cumulativeness of society needs to be thinking of how we're all interconnected, just like biodiversity. The greater landscape is interconnected, and we should be thinking about our downstream neighbors. And at the same time, I wish society was advanced enough to say, hey, Loretto, you're at our headwaters, you're super important, so we should help you protect your land because you're important to the greater impact of all this. I don't have a great, I don't know of what's happening. There are networks of groups, like particularly in the land trust community. There's umbrella groups that help groups network and share, just like in any different disciplines. But there are a lot of conversations being had around this, and there are regional initiatives, particularly along the Gulf Coast, but in the upper stretches of the watershed, that people are trying to share resources and share information to sort of affect and influence the greater conversation there. But I don't have a great solution to it, but
I just think it was such a wonderful presentation, and so short a time, since we had to make phone calls to Frankfurt to vote down the governor's request to sell off part of a very well-known forest.
yes.
And I wondered, do you ever do anything like this for Congress? Would you consider it?
Yeah. Well, thanks for suggesting that. What I'll say is KNLT is a non-advocacy organization. It's just our charter is not advocacy. It's not that we're not passionate. It's not that I go and talk to people in this space, but we work very closely with the Kentucky Conservation Committee, which KCC is a vital resource for taking on that advocacy role, watching for bills and promoting all that, as is Kentucky Resource Council, Tom Fitzgerald. Both of those entities are groups that we're very tightly associated with, both personally and organizationally. Like we help contribute to KCC, KNLT annually as a membership, because they take that frontline role of advocacy. So we have there are really defined limits on the space we have within our nonprofit and what our focus is to be advocates. There is space that we can talk about it, engage people, but there are these lines that we're careful of. So I personally am passionate, and I made many a call myself to that very number to talk about those things. But organizationally, it's really, we leverage it through partnerships mainly. And I think that the network that we have are sort of in that space. And also, at the end of the day, there's not that many groups, unfortunately, doing this kind of work or taking up that championship. So usually people that are attracted to our work are also attracted to KCC, or even Kentucky Heartwood, which is another group that's at the front lines around public land in the state. And we do partnerships and stay informed. I think the conservation community is pretty tight-knit and known, and we welcome greater growth within the state, because there are some real absent areas that don't have full coverage in the state to take on this kind of work. But yeah, but I would love to talk to anyone who'd be willing to listen.
I was going to ask Salt River, like we cross Salt River when we go up 31E, we go up I-65 when I go to Lexington, but where does it go? Like just,
so let me see.
I don't mean even a map, just tell us cities or something.
Well, it goes, so, from south of here, there's sort of Muldross Hill and the Knobs. It basically stretches almost over to the Daniel Boone. It stretches nearly to the Kentucky River. There's a kind of smaller divide from where the Salt River ends, and then the Kentucky drainage, because the Kentucky continues to get narrower and narrower as it goes north. It's really wide out in the mountains. So it stretches, out towards Shakertown. Shakertown's in the Kentucky, but it stretches quite a ways down. And the purposes of that project sort of defined it a little tighter, but it does go a little bit further to the west too. It's a giant watershed.
Thank you.
Yes.
What are those little birds, those little eggs at the bottom?
Oh, this is a little, thanks for asking. This is a little green salamander, and they hang out in little tiny cracks, and these are little salamander eggs. This is, you can barely see the salamander sitting here protecting their eggs. And we're lucky enough to have someone on staff that I like to call a salamander whisperer, because Derek seems to be able to find salamanders whenever you're out in the woods with them. And these are considered a rare salamander, and they like to hang out in these really narrow cracks in the rocks down in the mountains.
Thank you.
Sure. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much for sharing your knowledge and your passion and your heart for this land.